Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of The Happiness Standard. I am your host, Dr. Sarah Eileen-Downey Akers, and I am so glad that you're here. On today's episode, we are going to be talking about the difference between making excuses versus giving yourself grace. Have you ever thought about the difference between the two? I know it didn't really hit me until, honestly, last week in my small group. And so it's a really interesting concept. Let's go ahead and get into it together. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm so glad that you're here. So, before we get started, I did want to address something from last week's episode. So, I got a call that came in from one of my friends last week, and some of you caught on. And I do want to confirm that yes, it is Stone Cold Steve Austin's entrance music from the WWE. And so, it is probably a little bit of a surprise, but I am actually quite a big WWE fan. It has not always been like that. I got into it because it is something that my husband loves, and honestly, I can say with full confidence that it is something that it has turned into something that I love as well. I think it's action, it's adventure, it's characters, it's good versus evil. And if you have not, this whole Netflix era, ESPN Plus era, I really suggest that you watch it. It's very entertaining. But yes, my ringtone is Stone's. It is Stone's entrance music. And so let me just give you a little bit of an insight into why I call him Stone. So we were watching the Royal Rumble in January. It's one of their big PLE events. And Stone Cold is actually one of my husband's most favorite wrestlers. And we were talking, and if you don't know, Stone actually has his own podcast. And so we were getting ready, we were talking about the podcast, we were watching wrestling, and I was just being a goof. And so I said, well, of course, like from one podcast to another, we would be friends. And my husband goes, oh, really? So you are on a first name basis with him, so you call him Steve. And I said, no, well, of course I'm on a first name basis with him, but no, I call him Stone because it is Stone Cold Steve Austin. And so I think that it's great. I just call him Stone. It's a little inside joke that now all of you are in on as well. So if you guys like him, go ahead and tag him in the comments. We'll see if maybe we can have this kind of catch on. We can start calling him Stone. But anyway, yes, it is his ringtone. It is his entrance music. I'm sorry if it caught you off guard, but it's just real. That's what happens. It happened during filming last week, and I want to do my best to keep things authentic. But to answer your question, yes, it is Stone's entrance music. Now, within the last week, I also saw Wuthering Heights with one of my very close friends. I went into it kind of having an idea of what it would be. It was not what I expected. I think it was very aesthetically pleasing. The actors did such a great job. Margot Robbie is beautiful. Jacob Elordi did a great job. But I must say, what are we doing? What are we doing in the film industry? I also want to disclaim that I did not read the book. So this is my unsolicited opinion of the movie. I still think it was worth watching. I'm glad that I went and saw it, but it's definitely not what I thought it was going to be in terms of content. Um, so I'm not going to give anything away, but about 40 minutes into the movie, I was sitting there and I was like, "Oh, okay, it's not a huge story arc. It's not about character growth. It's really just about this relationship that's like toxic also, by the way. And it also like normalizes this concept of cheating in our culture and our society that I personally have a problem with. And while it was entertaining, visually stunning, the movie's just not for me. And that's okay, right? But I'm still glad that I saw it. And so that's just a little tidbit of, how my last week went. But on a different note, I am very proud of myself to be able to say that I went to the gym 5 days last week. And that is not something that I have done for a long time. So I'm really proud of myself for that. And now I didn't make excuses, but I almost did. I almost only went 4 days. But that concept of giving yourself grace versus making excuses is what we're actually going to be exploring today. So let's go ahead and get into the standard. Okay, so on this week's segment of The Standard, we are exploring the difference between asking yourself, are you giving yourself grace Or are you making excuses? So let's just roll with the gym example that I gave earlier. So you told yourself that you're going to the gym this week, and then you didn't go. And now you're telling yourself, well, it's been a long week. I don't need to. It's okay. Is that grace? Or is that an excuse? You said that you'd start the habit, that you'd have the hard conversation, or you'd apply for the opportunity, or you'd set the boundary. And somehow you're still in the same place. Are you being kind to yourself? Or are you protecting your comfort? Because those two can sound almost identical, but they lead to very different outcomes, which ultimately can lead to two very different lives. I think that we confuse grace and excuses because it's harder to admit that we're making excuses than it is to say that we're giving ourselves grace. Grace feels gentle. Excuses feel justified. And both can sound compassionate in the same moment. It's easy to confuse the two. But only one of those changes your trajectory. Grace makes room for growth, whereas excuses makes room for repetition. Now, repetition doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks familiar. Sometimes it's the same avoidance that you've been experiencing. It's the same habits. It's the same internal dialogue you've been telling yourself. Grace says, you're human. Try again. Excuses say, well, that's just who you are. Big difference between the two. But here's where there's a difference that's very subtle that most people miss. Excuses slowly lower your expectation of yourself. Not all at once and not dramatically, but just quietly. Because it starts with, well, it's been a long week. I'll start next week. But then it becomes, well, it's just a busy season right now. And then that evolves to, well, this is just who I am. I might as well accept it. And then there's this shift, right? There's this shift from not necessarily strong to weak, but from being very hopeful about something to feeling settled. And every time that you excuse what you know that you're capable of improving, you adjust the bar. Just a little bit, right? Not a whole lot, but just enough to make it comfortable. And so big emphasis here. Emphasis on making an excuse for what you know you are capable of improving. And that's not to say that we have control to be able to improve everything in our lives. But I'd like to think that deep down, when we're honest with ourselves, we know when we've cut ourselves short versus when we've done our best. And that's really what we're exploring here. So this is what I was saying earlier when I said I almost didn't go to the gym 5 days. So I told myself that I would go on Thursday. Sure enough, Thursday rolls around and, my husband goes to work in the morning and then I'm doing stuff with my mom and, we have people coming over to the house. And one of my very close friends, the same one that I saw Wuthering Heights with last week, she did her bar exam this week, which is very exciting. She won't know if she passed until May. But she wanted to celebrate, I should say. She wanted to celebrate on Thursday because she finished it on Wednesday. So we were going to go to lunch. And we went to lunch, and while I was sitting there, the clock it just started to get closer, it started to get closer and closer to 5 o'clock. And honestly, once 5 o'clock rolls around, there's not much that I want to go out of my way for. I'd like to be done with my day. I'd like to be able to relax. And so I said, well, it's been a long week. Thursday has kind of traditionally been my day that I rest. And honestly, so I was sitting there and I was thinking this through and I texted my husband because he's my best friend and I tell him everything. So I was like, I've tentatively decided to not go to the gym today. Here's why. And I sat there and I sent it off to him and he responded and he said, okay. He's like, if you're good with that decision, then as long as you're good with it, then it's okay. And I sat there and I thought about it and I was like, wow. I was like, honestly, these are just excuses for why I don't want to go. And so then I got home and I was thinking about it and the sun was setting, right? Because we haven't hit that spring forward yet with the time change. And I'll say, you know what? I'll just go tomorrow. Or it's not that serious. 4 days is still really good. You can still be proud of that. But in that moment, it wasn't about the workout, right? It was about the bar that I had set for myself on Monday, saying that I would go to the gym 5 days. And so then, because it was about the bar that I had set for myself, I had to ask myself, was I going to meet it or was I going to move it? And man, as soon as I framed it like that, I I've also been doing this thing recently where I separate my mind from my body because my body generally does not want to do the hard thing. It does not want to do the hard thing. It doesn't want to work out. It doesn't want to run. It doesn't want to wake up early. My mind, on the other hand, I have a very strong mind, or at least I'd like to tell myself that. And so my mind says, no, you can go to the gym. You can wake up early. You can run. And so when I separate those two, I just will my body to do what my mind wants to do. And so I ended up going to the gym. And sure enough, I had a fantastic workout. And shockingly, I actually have taken up running. And I say that not like I'm a runner, but I've done it like 3 days this week and I feel pretty good about myself. And so that's nice. Um, but I'm so happy that I didn't fall into the idea of just making an excuse for myself and lowering that bar, right? I was lowering the bar that I had set for myself. And honestly, me beforehand would have been totally fine with it, right? But now I'm recognizing that I have the ability to rise to that occasion if I allow myself to. Because the danger of excuses is not that you fail, it's that you start expecting less of yourself. And honestly, I have done that in terms of like fitness, right? Specifically for a very long time. And then you just start expecting less discipline, less courage, less honesty, less effort. And then once you start expecting less, you just stop reaching for those high standards, right? Because that expectation of yourself is now lower. And I didn't like that. And so excuses don't destroy your potential overnight, right? That's not what I'm saying. But they slowly convince you that maybe you don't have as much to offer as you thought that you did. When in reality, that could not be further from the truth. Because I've noticed that when I repeatedly justify the same thing, right? It's the same story that I'm telling myself, that I'm not consistent, that I'm not disciplined. Well, I'm just not a morning person, or I'm just not a wake up early in the morning and go to the gym person. The more that I say it, the more that I believe it, the more I justify it. Grace, on the other hand, never lowers the standard. It strengthens you so that you can rise to it. Much, much different than making excuses for yourself. Because excuses adjust the standard to fit you, whereas grace helps grow you to meet that standard. And that's the difference between those two things. At least that's what I'm learning. And sometimes that growth can feel terrifying. It can feel scary because it's unfamiliar. But the thing is, and what I try to tell myself, is that it feels scary because it's unfamiliar, not because I'm not capable. I'm going to say that again. It feels scary because it's unfamiliar, not because you're not capable. I cannot tell you how many times in the last couple years I have told myself that actively, where I've been actively in a situation where I'm like, I can feel fear, right? It starts to creep up. And I stop it and I remind myself of that I am capable. It's just unfamiliar. And so, because when I tell myself that I'm not capable, then I just don't even try because it's scary. And then you think about failure and you think about all these implications about what it might mean for yourself. But if I admit that I am capable, now I have a choice, right? Now I have kind of this awakening. Because when we're making excuses, it means that we're admitting that we're capable of more. And that's hard because when we admit that we're capable of more, it means that we've been accepting a lower standard for ourselves than maybe we have been meaning to. Because growth is courage and it's honesty with yourself and it's choosing to rise to the occasion instead of negotiating with your potential. So let me ask you this. So if in 6 months from now, if you think that everything in your life looks the same, Is it you maybe have the same habits, the same reactions, the same potential avoidance of something that you've been meaning to do? Would you call that grace? Or would you say that it's fear slash excuses? Because grace should leave you stronger, not stagnant, not smaller, but stronger. So you don't need to become someone else. You just need to stop pretending that you're not capable of becoming more. Because growth isn't about punishment, it's permission. It's you're not incapable, you're just being invited to rise to the occasion. And so when you give yourself grace, it ultimately still pushes you towards the goal. You're still moving, right? Whereas with excuses, you just stay stagnant. So here's a couple of questions that I really encourage you over this week, right? Or whenever it is that you're watching, to ponder, just to think about. Where in my life am I calling something grace that might actually be fear? And if I believed I was capable of more, what would I stop excusing? It's heavy. It's a simple question, but it's not an easy answer. So, whatever you came up with, whatever popped into your head just now, don't judge it, right? Don't push it away. Don't defend it, right? Just notice it. Just acknowledge it. Because awareness is the first time you stop lowering the bar. And the moment that you decide to meet the standard that you've set for yourself, even in one small area, something very powerful happens. You start rebuilding trust in yourself that you might not have even realized that you've lost. And it's not because you became someone new overnight, right? It will take time, but it's because you stopped pretending that you couldn't rise to the occasion, when in reality, you know that you can. And so that brings us to this week's rotating segment of Unfiltered Wins, which is one of my favorite. I'm very excited because it's not about perfection, but it's about the moments that you meet the bar that you've set for yourself instead of lowering it. Let's get into it. All right, and we're back with this week's segment of Unfiltered Wins. We have an email from Bryn from Wyoming. So she says, "Hi, I'm submitting this as my unfiltered win for the week. I asked for a raise, and I got it. Congratulations, Bryn. I've been in my role for 3 years, consistently taking on more than what's required. I've trained new hires, stepped into leadership when it was needed, stayed late, solved problems that weren't technically mine to solve. We've all been there. And for a long time, I kept telling myself it wasn't the right time to ask. I'd say things like, the company's going through changes, or I should just be grateful that I have a job, or maybe next quarter. But this week, I stopped waiting for the perfect timing. I scheduled the meeting. I walked in prepared. I laid out my contributions clearly. I spoke about my impact without downplaying or laughing it off. I didn't apologize for wanting more. I didn't soften my language to make it easier for everyone else. And they said yes. My raise was approved. But honestly, the biggest win wasn't even the number. It was realizing that I didn't have to wait to feel more confident or more ready. I just had to decide that my work had value and act accordingly. For the first time in a long time, I felt aligned with myself. I didn't shrink. I didn't hesitate. I advocated. And that felt powerful. Thank you for listening, Bryn." Wow. That is very powerful. Congratulations again, Bryn. So I love this. I think something that really stood out to me in what she was saying is that you said that you waited a long time for the right time to happen. And we do that so often. We tell ourselves next quarter, after this project, when things calm down, when I feel more confident. But sometimes later is actually fear that's dressed up as patience. And you kind of have to know how to navigate between those two. because we might convince ourselves that we're being strategic or we're being considerate or we're being responsible, when really we're just avoiding the discomfort that often comes with advocating for ourselves. And what I love about this win is the shift that you had, that you didn't wait for the perfect conditions, right? You scheduled the meeting anyway. And they showed up, or I should say, you showed up, you spoke clearly, and it went the way that you wanted it to. Because the thing is that you don't always feel ready before we act. Sometimes you act, and then that's what makes you realize that you were actually ready all along. And that is just the best feeling, right? So the raise was the result, of course, but the real win was being able to step outside of that comfort zone and you stopped postponing your own growth because you embraced it. You said, you know what? I'm going to meet it where it's at and I'm going to show up and we're just going to see where it goes. And sure enough, you found out that that was more than enough and you got what you asked for. Um, and that's really powerful. And it's so exciting because that's like such a very adult thing in the world to be happy about, that you got a raise, which I just love. That's not something that I have had to do in the adult world yet, but I know that when it does, that I will probably take a play out of your book. And being able to just know that you're allowed to ask for these things and know that it's okay. So, congratulations, Bryn. I'm very excited for you, and I hope that you do something fun to celebrate this new raise, whatever that is. So, on our unfiltered wins, it was very kind of adult, right? So to speak. Now, let's go ahead and shift a little bit into our Glimmer segment, where I was reminded of the beauty of being a kid. Okay, welcome back to this week's segment of Glimmer. So, this week, my Glimmer happened at a red light. I was on my way to the gym, and I was just sitting at a red light when I noticed that 2 cars ahead of me and 1 lane over, the driver had both windows down on that side of the car. And it looked like they were talking to the car next to them, which was actually in my lane. And it appeared that a dad was driving, and there was a little girl sitting behind him. And she, while the window was rolled down, she had a teddy bear that she brought up close to the window, and she waved the little teddy bear's hand at the car across from them. And she waved the little bear's arm, and I didn't even see the other car's reaction, right? I didn't get to see that. I kind of wish that it was me so that I could have waved back to her. But in that moment, it was so small, and it was honestly, it was really only a few seconds. But it stopped me because it was so simple. And there was just something, it was so pure and it was so innocent. It was just a kid in the back seat with her teddy bear, her dad driving. There's probably no self-consciousness, no self-awareness, no overthinking. And she just waved. She waved that little teddy bear's arm. And it was just a small thing in her day. But I saw that and it reminded me of being little. And it reminded me of sitting in the back seat and feeling safe and letting my imagination fill those quiet moments in between stoplights. And it reminded me of when the world felt big instead of very heavy, which is how it can feel now. And it made me wonder, when did we stop waving? When did we start filtering our softness that we can have if we allow ourselves to? When did we decide that small, sweet moments were too insignificant? Because she didn't hesitate. She didn't look around to see if anyone was watching her or judging her. She didn't pause to think, oh, is that person gonna wave back? She didn't calculate the risk of being ignored. She just did it. She lifted the bear and waved. There's no performance, no protection, no pre-rejection. It was just pure expression. Just a kid being a kid. And I thought to myself, when did we start needing a guarantee before we showed up as soft? When did that happen? And when did we start guarding the smallest parts of ourselves that we have a potential to share with others? Because I think in our world today, there's a lot going on. And I think that people need a soft space to land. And not only a soft space to land, but they need to be able to see softness in others. And that's not to say that we need to be like that all the time, but I think it's important that we don't lose that soft side of us. And that little girl did not know that she gave me a glimmer. I don't even think that she didn't even recognize probably that there were cars behind her, right? But she did. And in that moment, she showed me that softness still exists, even in traffic, on a random weekday, on Thursday, by the way, the day that I almost didn't want to go to the gym, that I almost made the excuse but didn't. That's the day that I saw my glimmer, which honestly, looking back at it now, is probably intentional, right? Little, one of those times when God winks at you, you know? But even on a random weekday, even on the way to the gym, sometimes we can just wave and that's enough. And so sometime this week, I hope that you have the opportunity to show softness to someone. Maybe someone that needs it. Maybe someone that doesn't, but maybe it's something that you just feel good about. So, more than anything, thank you for listening and spending time with me. I am so happy that you're all here. I hope this episode gave you some food for thought. And you can ask yourself in different parts of your life, are you making excuses or are you giving yourself grace? And maybe if you hadn't thought about it, now you know the difference between the two a little bit more. But more than anything, I hope that this week you don't forget to make happiness your standard and not just your goal, so you're not chasing it. I'll see you guys next week. Bye.